A few days ago, there was an interesting conversation on Twitter, or perhaps conversation is not actually the right term. Pile on might be a better, more appropriate term, and it was also an appropriate and deserved pile on, I think we can say. So here is the tweet from an Oxford philosopher, John Tasioulas, who wrote, "If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about Oxford." That part probably wouldn't have gotten him in too much hot water, but then he had to follow it up with this: "It's the only real home of your discipline." So, shots fired across the bow, and a lot of people had opinions about this. They weighed in on it. So we're going to look at a few of them, the ones that are most interesting, and we'll talk about some of the implications of it. Now, some people picked up right off the bat on the very first part of it. So we see there's something inexpressibly stupid about this tweet, claiming that there's a profundity to Oxford that is inexpressible is kind of a dumb thing to say. Someone else said, pretty bad at training philosophy if you can't express it. And then here's another great one. Elitism wasn't too difficult to express. And then these are two really great ones following up. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep about this college, not one single philosopher. So it's kind of saying that this is not the sort of thing that anyone who's a real philosopher would be talking about or tweeting about. And then finally, this is the best one. She watched as the Oxford man Oxforded down the stairs. Oxford is so inexpressible, so therefore we just have to use the word Oxford. Then moving on to the second part of the tweet, we see that a lot of people weighed in with alternate locations. The University of Paris, like the Sorbonne, would like a word. Sorry, but it's actually Zhosheng Shandong. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about Bodh Gaya. It's the only real home of your discipline. And then I understand this, but you cannot seriously say it's the only real home of philosophy. I would probably point to ancient China as another place you could call that. And then here's another one. Now, these have all been kind of plausible to this point. Here's one that I had to laugh at. My own, somewhat admittedly constrained understanding of the field is that New York University is the leading contemporary center for philosophy today. What's more, is it not the case that Oxford has been famous for specializing in linguistics and conceptual analysis at the expense of a wider scope? Now, the idea that NYU University, you would have to be equally obtuse as this Oxford person to believe that. Here's another one. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about Irvine, California. It's the only real home of your discipline. Maybe that one was joking. And then we get Oxford is no Chicago, and it's certainly no Auburn, Alabama. Actually, it's Akron, Ohio. And then finally, if you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about Philosophické Fakultät. It's the only real home of your discipline. We get a couple other ones that are, in essence, saying, Oxford actually isn't that important. Other places are. So here's one. 40 years of Parisian philosophy is non-ironically much more impressive, impactful, and interesting than probably everything that happened in Oxford after Locke in the 17th century. Here's another one. There are like 4 or 5 German universities that have had a greater impact on contemporary philosophy than Oxford. Even when British philosophy was of some importance, Oxford wasn't. And then last, if you knew anything about philosophy, you'd know that Oxford has never been a serious place for philosophers, and no, Locke doesn't count. The real Don was at Cambridge, and Keynes met him on the 5:15 train. So there was a really great tweet responding to all of these things, saying this: still, the replies unironically suggesting alternative homes make this a great litmus test for ass backwardness in the field, and I completely agree. When I myself posted the original tweet onto my social media, I had a lot of people weighing in and saying, but what about Athens? And my response was, what is wrong with you that you think that there has to be an only real home of your discipline? I mean, how would you figure that out in the first place? And what the hell good would that do you? And why are you so obsessed with that when really we can do, as we're going to talk about later, philosophy anywhere? So the people who are saying, oh, Oxford, that's not the place. Over here is the place. They're kind of, as, what would we call it, obsessed with status, obsessed with figuring out who's number one as the original foolish poster. So we move on, and we get a bunch of good joking ones about philosophy. So here's a set of them. Some of them have pictures. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about McDonald's. It's the only real home of your discipline. The joke being, of course, that you're not going to find a job with philosophy, which, okay, that's low-hanging fruit and actually kind of incorrect and dumb low-hanging fruit too. Then we see a picture of Diogenes in his barrel. Somebody else saying, if you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about a barrel. It's the only real home of your discipline. Now that one's getting at something important. The discipline depends on what we mean, so the home is going to be indexed to what we think philosophy is. Then we get another one. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about the gym. It's the only real home of your discipline. And now that's not as far off as you might think, at least for the Western philosophical tradition that doesn't have its origins, of course, in Athens, because philosophy is going on for several centuries before the rise of Athens as a cultural superpower. But they were gymnasiums that were quite important at that time. Going on, here's some funnier ones. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about the panopticon. It's the only real home of your discipline. The panopticon being the idea suggested by Jeremy Bentham, of course. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. It's the only real application of your praxis. And then finally, this is a great one. If you're a philosopher, there's something deep and inexpressible about the cave. It's the only real home of your discipline. The jokes get even better when we move on to other disciplines by comparison. So, for example, if you're an architect, there's something deep and inexpressible about the Bass Pro Shop Pyramid. It's the only real home of your discipline. Now that one hits home, right? Because the Bass Pro Shop is quite notable, and there's a lot of people who think that it's an important monument, but what do real architects think about that? I don't know. What do real philosophers think about how important Oxford and its people are? Then here's a similar one. If you're a musician, there's something deep and inexpressible about Guitar Center. It's the only real home of your discipline. And we get, if you're an economist, there's something deep and inexpressible about Chicago. It's the only real home of your discipline. Now that could be because of the importance of the University of Chicago, but you could also say, well, what else is in Chicago? The Mercantile Exchange, right? And quite a few other important economic features. Then we get, if you're a Torah scholar, there's something deep and inexpressible about the land of Israel. It's the only real home of your discipline. The funny thing is that where was the Talmud actually formulated? Was it just in the land of Israel or Palestine? Or was it also in Babylon, right? And then here's a joking one as well. If you're an accelerationist, there's something deep and inexpressible about energy dissipation. It's the only real home where morality reduces to the physics of heat and to the usual kind of mumbo jumbo that accelerationists love to indulge in. Now, moving on, we get some people having things to say about Oxford itself and presumably about the institution of Oxford, which has done a really great job in, let's call it, PR for themselves and how important they are in the world. So we have a whole wealth of comments here. Let's go through them, and they don't require too much comment, I think. Just about the most Oxford remark imaginable, I would say that would be quite true if it weren't for the fact that people at elite universities all say stuff like that, right? So people at Harvard think that Harvard is the indubitably best place in the world. People in Parisian schools, oh, Paris is the center of the universe. So anyway, moving on, I don't really see why anyone would think that a third-tier training school in the lowlands has much to contribute to our society at all. And a training school is actually a good name for it because, given the way in which things tend to work in Britain, it really is for training up elites who then have a sense that they're the ones who should be running the show. Oxford excels in instilling an unfounded sense of arrogance above all else. Probably so. I think that Harvard and Yale and, other places can give them a run for their money. This stuff used to really bother me, but now I find the Oxfordian faith in their own wan empiricism inspiring. Like a small dog snarling at a city bus. What a wonderful metaphor there. Here's another one. Yes, home is where every question worth asking is peremptorily described as malformed, and history is a sort of notion which people have distantly heard of but have never seen. That's probably not that off. Oxford educated. Now this is about Gillian Rose. Rose fitted only uncomfortably into what Adorno called the still medieval order there. Rose would later assert that it taught students little more than how to be clever and ignorant, supercilious, and destructive. Then we have two others. This is the kind of philosopher that starts foaming at the mouth when he hears decolonialization or women in philosophy. And then another one about what we could call openness or representation. And what has Oxford done to make itself feel like home to all the philosophers around the globe? Now, that is a great question there. Is it just about being swarmy and elite and thinking yourself better? Or is it about saying, oh, this is something we should share with everybody else? I don't see a lot of that going on. There's a couple that are about long walks. Actually, they have long walks everywhere. Long walks are not locationally bound. There's nothing special about taking a long walk at Oxford for promoting thinking. Now, there's some really weird ones, and I'm not sure. Maybe somebody can fill me in. Is there a sort of scatological tradition having to do with Oxford people? You might tell me about this. So I'll read these to you, and you can tell me what it means. People are really dunking on this guy, but it isn't his fault. The smell of your own farts is always sweetest. And then someone's bathing in his own farts again. And then these people get so high on their own farts. I remember standing in the Christchurch quad and being like, wow, Locke wrote some really racist stuff here, and moving on with my day. I guess the wacky Wittgenstein anecdotes were cool though. And then give us a shout when you've navigated your way out of your own arse. Yeah. So I don't know. Is there some sort of joke that I don't know about because I mix so little with Oxfordians or whatever they call themselves, whatever weird moniker they have? All right, moving on, we get some better takes, right? And so this is where, I mentioned this before, this is where we're going with this. The home of the philosopher is in the realm of thought, you hack. Right? And that's completely right. You can be a philosopher really anywhere. You don't have to have gone to the best school. As a matter of fact, that may be a handicap in many respects, as perhaps we'll talk about somewhere else. Here's another one. This sentiment expresses the sickness in valorizing the aesthetic of traditionalism. You get minds trapped in themselves. The home of philosophy is in the air between engaged interlocutors of the world, not found in old universities. Now, I'd agree with that completely, except for that very last line. There's nothing that says you can't do philosophy in an old university. It's just that you don't need an old university to do philosophy. And I like this, the home of philosophy is in the air between engaged interlocutors of the world. Then we've got three other really good ones. Philosophy is everywhere. It's lived, not merely studied. A professional student of philosophy should know this. And I think that's quite right. But, people get bound up within their peculiar little ideas about prestige, their parochialism, and think that the place that they're doing it is the place to do it. Here's another great one. Writing is the actual home of philosophy, and it exists everywhere you go. Only idiots think art is isolated to universities. This isn't 1340. I don't need an Ivy League to read the great minds of the world or have an overpriced failed author teach me how to write. I would say even in 1340, there were people still doing philosophy outside of universities. And then finally, I wonder if any of the Advaita Vedanta folks would find this a compelling claim, not to mention Taoist, Confucian, Ubuntu, or an awful lot of people who do a lot of thinking around the world. Of course, I'm not a philosopher, so probably I'm missing something. And, other than the name dropping of big, important, non-Western movements, I would say that's completely on track. So you can think about what your point of view is on this. I think, as I put here, there is clearly a lot to think about with this. And, people say a lot of dumb stuff on the internet. Very clever people, otherwise intelligent people, occasionally step in it. And so, at the very least, we can thank John Tasioulas of Oxford for giving us an interesting matter to mull over. So I look forward to seeing what you think about this conversation, about whether, elite universities are the place to go or whether they are the only real home for the discipline of philosophy, as this guy somehow came to the viewpoint expressing that. So we'll close here and think about this, see what you come up with.